Jake, let me pursue that one a little bit further because I think when it comes to sourcing and really getting any information, China is a world unto itself. And so I think the common image is that China really is sort of an authoritarian black box. It's hard to get any information at all. It's a monolith and, let alone persuade people to talk to you. So I'm hoping, Dake, you can tell us more on 2 points. The first on sourcing. How did you find sources in China and how did you protect them? And the second on navigating the Chinese bureaucracy. How did you get into the black box?
Right. So let me tackle the second question first, actually, the black box. I like to talk about this because I think it's a common idea that is very widespread and discourages people from even trying to start, which I think is an unfortunate mistake because it is incredible what you can find that is publicly available if you know where to look. It's probably beyond the scope of just this panel. I mean, I've had entire trainings around this, but I mean, essentially, the Chinese bureaucracy is extremely well organized, and they actually have a lot of information that they gather and collect and will put on various websites, such as court records. They'll have procurement tenders. They'll have statistical yearbooks. They'll have corporate records. I mean, the amount of information that is available is actually quite astonishing. Obviously, some of this information has been considered politically sensitive and may not be released, but there's still a lot of stuff to find if you go to Chinese websites, if you go to these document repertoires, and so on and so forth. So I often find that my work in terms of reporting on China involves a kind of interaction between going between documents and what we can find, and going with sources, because the sources will really tell you a lot more about what these policies or what these statistics actually look like on the ground, and that's very important. I always tell people I think sourcing in China is kind of like peeling an onion. You have people who are willing to talk to the foreign media, perhaps first approach. So oftentimes those are just people who are foreigners, right? Like they're experts on China for various reasons. They've been working in China for 20, 30 years, foreign executives who used to be in China, academics, so on and so forth. Or they're, Chinese, former officials or engineers or company executives who no longer live in China and are based outside of the country and therefore are also much more willing to talk to journalists, and you can actually use China's opacity to your advantage because information is power. Oftentimes, the country often runs on rumors, I think, like rumors about, oh, what policy is going on, oh, what is going on in China. So, as a journalist, you actually have a certain inbuilt advantage because you can offer that tantalizing promise of more information, which I think is not
Gossip,
limited
Dake.
just to China. Oh, yes, it's gossip. Yeah. I suspect, Byron in DC also knows very well how this operates, but it also works in China. And then, obviously you start with that first layer and then you start peeling it back. You ask people for introductions, you make it very clear what you're looking for, and it always surprises me how far you can actually go. I mean, obviously there's some pretty hard limitations. Sometimes it's pretty difficult to get people inside the government to talk to you directly. I mean, that's an incredible risk. But the other thing is actually, if you put your public information out there, your contact information, and I know that might not necessarily be convenient for everyone, but I have always been surprised by the number of people inside China, sometimes in position of power, who are willing to contact me directly. Because, as Mary, as you said, China is not a monolith. There are various competing, branches of the government, various competing officials, various competing interest groups, and sometimes they're not happy with what's going on in China. And so if you provide that, but they don't know where to turn to, and the foreign media can be kind of the place of last resort. Obviously, there's all these internal channels by which they can kind of register their dissatisfaction. But when they really feel like there's nowhere else to turn, they know that the foreign media is the one place where the Chinese authorities cannot censor them. So sometimes they will contact us directly.
Jake's approach has been enlightening to me in one respect, in that, as he says, it's not a monolith, it's a vast society of human beings. And like human beings everywhere, they fight and they're jealous of each other and they want to get back at each other. And there are fallings out, and they're like, well, don't write about me, but I have absolutely no problem if you write about so and so over there. So that I think was good to know. Dave, I also wanted to ask you in particular, how did you protect sources in this? And indeed, I mean, the AP got harassed in China as well. Can you deal a little bit with, I mean, with Dake, the question we often get is, how is it that you have not been thrown out of China yet?
That's a really, really good question. I'm not
Yeah.
entirely sure I know the answers to that one either, to be honest with you. But I will say that I think being a foreign correspondent in China, someone said this to me very early on, and I think it's very true. It's like having a ring of fire around you. You yourself are protected, but anyone who gets too close to you gets burned. And I think that's pretty spot on. So we have almost a weird kind of quasi-diplomatic immunity status of some sort. We're managed under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China, and we're almost treated as though we are part, like, like a branch of a foreign government or something, although obviously we are not. But that does confer certain benefits, which is that we are treated with a certain mixture of respect and fear. And if you know how that works, then you can work. I mean, the biggest thing is I don't worry about my personal safety. I do think the worst thing that can happen is that I personally get thrown out of the country. I'm a lot more concerned about the safety of the sources that I speak to. And honestly, I mean, with China, there can be quite a lot of gray areas, but I mean, there's all the obvious precautions. I mean, obviously you have to use a lot of encryption. I mean, I'm incredibly paranoid about my electronic devices, and I've studied every single possible way of securing all my communications, and also things like making sure that you don't write your interviewees' names down in your notes, because in the off chance that your computer does get cracked, even if they do see your notes, you still aren't exposing someone, for example, right? But also, meeting people outside of China, and there's just a lot of nuanced things. Maybe too much detail to get into on this call, but just a quick one, for example, if where you're in China matters a lot. If you're meeting someone in Beijing, for example, the local authorities in Beijing don't seem to care very much about what we're doing, because I think largely it's because there's, tens of thousands of diplomats that they're much more concerned about than us. But the moment you go out into the provinces, all of a sudden you're like, the scary foreign journalist coming to the local county town, and the county party secretary is very concerned about what you will write, and they will send, thugs or police or whoever it is to go and watch you and whoever you are talking to. And so there's a lot of these kinds of nuances when it comes to interacting with sources, that plays a role there. So yeah, I think I'll.
Jake, how were AP reporters also harassed in China? I mean, in terms of, was it just that you were followed around by the thugs? I mean, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it can come in all sorts of different ways. I do have to say I have not gotten the worst of it, which again is kind of interesting. I think there. So, I mean, for example, I mean, with this project specifically, when we went to the visit the Youngs, who are the kind of the main characters of the first piece, we were being watched by the authorities, because the Youngs are under surveillance, as we detail, very heavy surveillance. So they noticed when we visited, and they promptly showed up and intercepted us at one point, and hauled us away to a local conference hall, where they proceeded to have a meeting with us, where they expressed concern about, what we were doing, and they basically wanted to tell their side of the story, which we didn't publish because they made it clear that they wanted it to be all off the record. So I won't go into what they said here. But there's stuff like this, but there's often quite a bit of, again, because we have this kind of almost quasi-diplomatic status, there's actually a surprising amount of room to kind of push back or to appeal to higher authorities within China. For example, you can say, oh, well, according to Chinese law, we are allowed to report in these areas. And if you are not okay with that, then we're going to call the foreign ministry in Beijing. And that implicit threat of involving higher authorities can actually, give you a certain amount of space to push back. Um, I also think that being respect, just having a base level of respect or cordiality towards the officials and not letting them, kind of get to you is actually quite important because you have to remember that it's not personal, right? When the government, whenever there's some government authority, state security or police or officials or whoever it is that's approaching you, it's their job, right? I mean, you may not like the fact that it's their job to intercept you or monitor you or, somehow impede your reporting. But it's also not because they hate you personally as a human being. And so I often find that if you treat those people with a basic degree of respect and understanding that this is simply their job and this is what they have to do, that actually gets you pretty far. Because once they recognize that you're treating them as a person, they'll also reciprocate back and not necessarily, treat you with hostility. So there's a lot of things like that.
I wanted to ask everyone, please feel free to post questions in the chat. And in a few minutes, we will go to questions and we'd be very interested to hear what you're thinking about and what you'd like to know about. Um, in the meantime, one other thing I wanted to touch on. So this project focuses a lot on AI and surveillance technology. So it seems only right that we talk a little bit about how we used AI. So Garance and Byron, I am going to throw that one to you guys to start with. So Garance, you want to start us off?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm based, excuse me, in San Francisco, where, of course, AI is on all the billboards and how it'll change our lives. And, we wanted to approach this reporting with an openness to how these technologies could also help us do our work more efficiently. And so the Trump administration had been putting out just a huge number of contracts for bid on sam.gov. And we thought, wouldn't it be more efficient to see if we could scrape the sam.gov website and then get an AI generated summary of what each of these contracts was seeking? There's a huge amount of money from the One Big Beautiful Bill, for example. DHS was seeking a lot of technology. Byron and I were really trying to keep track of all the different technological systems. And so our colleague on the data team wrote a scraper using an R script and then just pulled in from the sam.gov API, a drip of these contracts with an AI generated summary. Now, to be clear, following AP standards, we never inserted any of that AI generated summary into our copy, but it gave us sort of a ballpark idea of what kinds of technologies the Department of Homeland Security was seeking. And then, as Byron mentioned, these very dry policy documents about the privacy concerns that DHS had also were something that we thought was fair game to summarize using AI just to give ourselves a sense of what they contained. If you want to talk a little bit more about that, Byron.
Yeah, I mean, I used a couple of commercial off-the-shelf, widely available AI tools to do things like summarization or writing basic web scrapers. So, like Grants just said, at one point, I downloaded all of the what are called privacy impact assessments, which is a DHS policy document documenting every single system that DHS uses. They write this long thing about how what it does, what's in it, and how to mitigate privacy concerns. And there's also a document called a SORN, which is a system of record notice. And these are all extremely dry policy documents from DHS, but we put them into Notebook LM, which is a particularly useful tool because when it spits out, when you ask questions of it, it will actually definitively link to the line in the document that it's deriving the answer from. And so you as a journalist can have a lot more assurance that when it answers something, you can actually then click back to the primary source and make sure that it's true. And again, we largely use this mostly for our own understanding and to kind of save some time, and to ask questions of a large volume of documents. And then another point, we built a very, very simple web scraper, for all of the flock cameras. So what we had found at some point was that the license plate reader company Flock had these disclosure portals, and they were like transparency dot flock dot, and then it was the town's name. And so we could search that top level domain for anyone that reported sharing data with the Department of Homeland Security. So we built a really simple web scraper to pull that down, and then we had a summer intern who actually sort of manually checked it. So we're not sort of using AI for writing stories or anything like that, but the ability to get new forms of data from the web quickly, and to summarize large volumes of documents, as long as you're doing it responsibly, as long as you're not accepting the output as gospel truth, is very helpful, especially in the early stages and the prospecting stages of the reporting.